Hey everybody, Phil Graham here, creator of the Beneficiary Liquidity Plan. We are lucky today to have my friend Jon O'Hara on the video with us. Jon owns Great Lakes Partnership. A little background on Jon. Jon has spent over 20 years directly in the funeral business. From a young age, he was working inside the four walls of the funeral home, done a lot of different jobs. And since then has started a consulting business that works directly with funeral homes. He's been inside of thousands of funeral homes all across the country and is actually married to a lady who is also in the funeral business. So there aren't many people in the country that have more experience working directly with families, working directly with funeral homes on these difficult times that unfortunately we're all going to go through at some point in our life, and that's losing a loved one and what actually happened. So we have Jon on the call today. We're going to ask him some questions, get his feedback. And Jon, do you want to expand anything on kind of your history or your experience before we get started?
I just, first of all, super excited to be with you today and continue to spread this message that we both know, right, is like critical right now. And with how things have changed significantly in funeral service, there's never been a more important time to have a plan. And what you and I have talked about over the last 2 months, we believe on the floor level of this that this is really not that difficult. And with my experience in with funeral homes across the country or eyeball to eyeball with families, it's more letting people know that these types of these plans are available, right? And getting the message out there, because most of them, when we sit down with families and we talk about connecting the heart to the mind and having funds available immediately in a time when is unique, where we lose somebody we love. There's no other scenario in life like that when we lose somebody we love dearly. So having a plan, having funds available, not having to have that stress as part of that process is really why you and I continue to try to spread this message. And I've seen it on the cathartic level with families of the look in their eyes. What are we going to do? Mom has money, but we don't have access to it. This is what we think her plans are, but we don't really know. And, all of these scenarios that we'll cover in these videos that we do together and why it's so important.
Absolutely. And kind of starting with the basics, and this is something I talk about every day, is that for generations, families have figured it out. When a loved one dies, they figure it out. Now, here's what my definition of figuring it out means. It means there's stress, there's arguments, disagreements, And the sad part about that is this is one of the worst days of these people's lives. They just lost a loved one. And instead of celebrating that person's life, they're arguing amongst the siblings, or they're searching for money. They're negotiating terms with lenders or funeral homes. And what really broke my heart was the majority of the time, the person that passed away had money. In their mind, before they died, they thought the family would just be able to magically access this money. And it just doesn't work that way. So in your experience, not only with your own funeral homes, but with the thousands that you've been in, is that a consistent, I don't want to call it a problem, but is that a consistent function of someone passing away? Is this component of stress and arguments and as opposed to pure celebration?
Yeah, 100%. And I always say sometimes silence is deafening, right? In these scenarios where there may not be the loud arguments in the arrangement room. And yes, those exist. And yes, I've been a part of those. But more often, you see where silence is in the looks on the face of, okay, whether it's the simplest of cremations or it's the most traditional of funerals, there is a cost associated with death always. And like you said, sometimes people just don't think that far ahead of when mom dies, she may have this really tightly packaged estate plan with the best estate planning attorney in town. And the facts of the matter are sometimes when that person dies, right, power of attorney ends, all these things change that people don't realize that they may have trouble at the arrangement room with the funeral home accessing funds. And we'll even take it a tier further that depending on your state, there's also people that fall in line of actually who is in charge legally in the arrangements, who are able to make decisions. So there are a lot of moving parts that people, and rightfully so, right? Who wants to talk about death? Like
Right.
it's when you make a purchase on a funeral, it's a problem aware purchase, right? And it's far more problem aware than we have a leaky roof and go on Google and search for a roofer. But that is the same type of, I guess, problem, right? We have to have a solution. And just like we don't want to have our roof fixed, we sure as hell times 10 do not want to make funeral arrangements for somebody we love. However, a lot of times people wait to the time when the problem is there and then have to make 150 decisions. Yes, 150 decisions. So that's labor intensive to begin with, to make all of those decisions in 1 2-hour meeting with a funeral professional. And
And
yes,
your mental capacity is probably not at 100%. If you're
absolutely
the
not.
loved one dealing with that.
And the scenarios could be all over the map. A sudden loss. They've been in hospice for 2 weeks. It's been a long drawn out where the family is just exhausted. The death of somebody young. I mean, there's so many scenarios that, to me, a lot of these decisions, including the financial piece, need to be and should be talked about in advance. And I've never had one person in my career who has planned ahead and that family's experienced a death, and that family has never turned around and said to me, I am so bummed out that my mom had this all figured out.
Right.
From the emotional decisions, the legal, and now this financial piece, right? It's never happened. It never will. So a lot of times what we see in that scenario in the arrangement room is one of the siblings, if they're both parents are gone, are then, who may be that executor who does not have the ability to fulfill those financial requirements because the estate has not been starting to be administered. So then they are having to reimburse themselves, and that, or they're paying for the funeral upfront out of their pocket, and then finding themselves having to be reimbursed when the estate starts being
Well, and a lot
administered.
of times, depending on how this estate is set up, it may not allocate for them to be reimbursed. And therefore, they're going to their siblings going, hey, Sally and Joe, I paid 20 grand. Can you both give me 10? And depending on the relationship, they might go, no.
Yep.
There's
It's
no
truth.
obligation for them to get reimbursed if it's not done properly.
Mm-hmm. And this is an easy one too, Phil, right? Like, we're all part of the 100% club, as I say. There's 2 guaranteed things in life: taxes and death. And we talk an awful lot about taxes, but we avoid this thing, which we know is there's always going to be a cost associated, always. And that's what my job, your job, as we continue to work together to educate families on what costs are, being prepared, because that does turn into, there's enough emotion, but if costs are not talked about ahead of time, it just compiles and compounds that emotional stress for the family, which is, like you said, back to the original point, totally unnecessary in many cases, right? So
when that comes to why we created the Beneficiary Liquidity Plan.
Absolutely.
And what I'm so passionate about is that if families already have any kind of assets that they've earmarked in their mind that when I pass, this is what my family's going to use.
Mm-hmm.
They're not buying more inheritance. They're not making premium payments to leave more money for their family. It's taking those dollars, no matter what dollar amount it is, that they want their family to use, and simply, easily, and quickly setting it up properly in advance. That's the key, in advance, so that on one of the worst days of the family's life, the day they pass away, they can access that money immediately, which eliminates the burden, the stress, the arguments, the disagreements. It doesn't matter if your kids have money or not. It causes problems. We want to eliminate that. And I believe 100% of my heart, because you're not buying anything and we're simply going a little bit of money from your left pocket to your right pocket, I can't think of a reason. Actually, there's two reasons. There's two reasons that people would not want a beneficiary liquidity plan. Do you want to know what they are, John?
I'd love to know.
The first reason is they don't have any money. Because remember, we're not creating any more money for the family. This is money that's already going to the family. So if someone doesn't have any money at all, that's a whole different scenario, but the beneficiary liquidity plan is not a solution for them. You ready for the second reason?
Please.
They don't like their beneficiaries.
Which can be fixed,
That's
right?
okay. But
right.
I had this gentleman in Chicago that said, Phil, my kids are getting $1 million and I'll be dead. What do I care? I'm not going to argue with the guy. That's his feelings. But what we found is that the majority of people don't want to be a burden to their family. They want to make sure that the funeral costs are covered. And we're going to go into a lot of those expenses in another segment, but
sure,
the funeral costs are covered. Travel expenses are covered, celebration of life, other bills that may need to be paid. It's not just the funeral or cremation. There are a lot of other expenses that somebody's having to pay for.
Absolutely. I mean, a death triggers these kind of checklists that go off in the beneficiaries or the next of kin in our world, as we'll say, where they realize, okay, my mom's dead, and now we have all these other things that come along with that. And yes, we got to focus on taking care of and honoring our mother, but there's things like taxes for the house. There's things like, maybe lawn maintenance, all of these things that come
along. You're going to sell the house and you need to get it updated to sell it.
Right. So all of those things that you and I both know happen when, and that's where I just love being able to connect like this, to be able to spread that message that these things happen. They're completely avoidable. To have, funds available immediately when someone dies is critical. I mean, it's one of the most important, probably missed pieces, I say, in the planning of end of life, whether it's estate planning, financial planning, planning with the funeral home, because there are people that come into a funeral home, just plan, don't have any financial backing behind that plan, whether it's through BLP or another source.
They're just window shopping, kind of.
Right.
They're making their Christmas list.
Exactly. So they feel like when they go and get these arrangements complete, yes, maybe some of those emotional decisions are made, but they leave the financial piece out. So 100 times over, I've taken phone calls by family members where deaths occurred, and they said, my mom has everything figured out with you, Jon. And I have to be, I don't want to say the bearer of bad news on top of the already bad news that they've, received today that their mother's died. But I have to say, look, your mother prearranged some of the services that she wanted, but there are no funds behind that. So, and in their minds, they called the funeral home thinking that everything was taken care of financially through a plan like this. And the idea is that it hadn't been. So they're very much disappointed to feel like, okay, now we're going to have to come up with a plan in a 24-hour period.
Well, that's where all of a sudden everybody starts putting their hands in their pockets and staring at their shoes.
Exactly.
Nobody wants to raise their hand and go, Jon, I got this. I had a really good year at work. You know what? I want the points on my Amex. I got this. Don't worry about it, brother. I got this. That doesn't happen.
It doesn't. Unfortunately, I won't say unfortunately, because a lot of times I, as a realist, say, look, I wish your mom would have done this. We've had her sign off that she doesn't want to put any financial backing behind this. But, and I think, we were going to talk about expectations of funeral homes and that when they expect to be paid nowadays, right?
Well, let's go ahead and talk about that. By the way, one key point we were talking about, the beneficiary liquidity plan, it is portable and can be used at any crematory, any funeral home.
100%.
It's not pre-locked in, because a lot of people don't know where they're going to retire,
100%.
what state they might die. They may not know if they want to be buried in the family plot or cremated and shot off in fireworks. So it's just a matter of setting aside the money that can be used regardless of what the ultimate scenario becomes.
And these plans are warmly welcomed by funeral homes worldwide. Our underwriter, right, NGL, is nationally, worldly recognized as a preferred provider for funeral establishments. Warmly welcomed, and anywhere, right, anytime within 48 hours. I mean,
And why would you like it if a beneficiary walked in with a beneficiary liquidity plan as a funeral home owner? You're going to get paid.
Right. So that's always reassuring, right? And that families have a plan, and this plan being one of the, if not the best plan to work with as funeral homes look for funding vehicles. I mean, they know funeral service. It's a simple claim form. Money is deposited based on the amount of services that are provided. Again, the most simplest of cremations up to the most traditional of funerals. The idea being that efficiencies and speed of that process come into huge play because, again, most funeral homes, and rightfully so, should be paid for their services in a timely manner, just like everything else, right?
Well, I think that's a perfect transition. Let's talk about that, because again, you've been in thousands of funeral homes.
Mm-hmm.
Your wife works in a funeral home. I believe you're actually working on designing and building what you think is the future of the funeral home business. And then you've also consulted with thousands of funeral homes across the country. So when someone passes away, the family comes in, because I hear this a lot from people go, oh, well, when my grandpa died, they gave us 60 days to pay. They're like, we go to church together. It's fine. Don't worry about it. Whenever you get the money, you get the money. Was that true? And then what is the reality today and why?
Yeah. So like being from Detroit, there's a saying, it's not your daddy's Oldsmobile anymore. Right. So,
right.
And times have changed. Extension of this person has gone to my parish for 50 years and their family is, we live across the street from each other. Those days of giving 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, expenses have gone up tremendously for businesses. Cash flow just is critical now for businesses, as all the things that continue to pile up in terms of expenses that didn't exist years ago, along with efficiencies. But we have entities like corporations in funeral service that own thousands and thousands of funeral homes nationally.
Like big, giant conglomerates.
Yeah.
Like just buying up many funeral homes.
Yeah, there's a huge wave right now of both independent guys like myself and large corporations where, there's a lot of baby boomers in our industry that are looking to retire. So, the corporations are there. They have been for a long time. They're looking to grow just like everybody else. They don't do a bad job. They just are looking to grow, right? But they expect, because they are publicly traded, to have services paid for prior to services in almost all cases, right? Before anything moves forward. Where you're going to find family-owned funeral homes may be a little bit more flexible on payment, but not so much anymore. Al, the local funeral director who owns a place downtown, just as it is important for the corporations, it's just as important for Al to be able to pay his part-time, pay his bills to the casket company. So he is asking for payment promptly by the time of service, more than likely. And sometimes the scenario that I see often is, well, mom has this MetLife policy and she's had it for years and we're not really sure if it's still valid. And, so now all of a sudden, they're telling us they're going to pay the funeral home 6 months from now. And the funeral home has a decision to make, which most of them are saying, we'll help you file the claim, but we need to be compensated now. And you can reimburse yourself with that policy, which doesn't feel good it's not a good process for anyone. Right. And mom didn't intend for that policy to go that way. She expected those funds to be available. It wasn't designed to be that way. And those funds 6 months down the road will be very helpful. But where the family needs the most help is right now with the funeral director and the expenses that come along with not just the funeral home, but everything else that we can talk about in a later segment that come along with funeral care, cemeteries, outside expenses, luncheons, travel expenses, death certificates, obituaries that are all outside expenses of the funeral home. So that's the timeliness of payment and the pressure that families feel. And that is quite honestly the most awkward conversations for these last responders, as we'll call them, the funeral directors, because nobody loves having that conversation in our profession either. Who is going to, the average funeral in the United States, together cremation, burial, falls right around $7,500. So it's
Well,
not
these funeral
every
homes are in sales. Let's not,
sure.
Because if they do a good job for, again, we're going to say the family,
Mhm.
then they're more likely to get repeat business, which is
Absolutely.
the goal is how do you get these families to continue to use you? And if they're having to have these awkward conversations, it's definitely not because they want to, it's
Right.
because they have to.
That's it. So exceptional service where you're hitting each mark and exceeding the expectations of things that they didn't even think existed is like really where my mind goes in terms of how we outperform people in service and be specific on those service items. But if and when I own a funeral home, I would expect payment because I'm busting my butt for that family and my heart is all in it. And just like when you have a great experience with, and I'm not correlating, going to a fantastic resort with your family. And yes, you could put that on a credit card and pay over time. But you can do that with funeral homes now too.
Right.
To go to for a vacation, for an experience. And I realize that we have to make this more of an experience for families. And that's what we're working on in funeral service. But we also need prompt payment. BLP opens the door, and we need more people to go through that door and realize, like you said, because they have the funds. It's not like mom hasn't planned financially for death. It's just moving from one pocket to the other so it's accessible to them and the funeral director for the services that mom has expressed she wanted,
Well,
right?
people just don't realize that the money's not available.
Right.
So I look at myself as an educator, spreading the word that, hey, your plan isn't going to work.
Right.
And guess what? Great news. It doesn't cost you anything to fix it. That's the best part.
True. And sometimes the beast doesn't rear its ugly head until you're in the arrangement. Like, it's the sister-in-law in the back of your head that you're like, this is going to be a problem, and she's at every family decision-making process. And now it's, well, mom said this and well, mom said this. And,
Right.
there's, and now it's a question of what do we spend? How do we spend it? So that's why equally, and where, guys like you and I with Great Lakes and BLP coming together and is also talking about having some of those choices made that we as a group can help folks, like as a funeral director, if they call me directly and say, hey, John, like what do you recommend in terms of cost for these types of services? We're going to be able to say, you set aside this much. This is why. This is what's going to happen on average, coast to coast, wherever you end up.
Right.
And having those funds available, because like I said, that beast will rear its ugly head in arrangement rooms when it comes to what to spend, how to spend it. And again, I have never been someone that will die on the hill of trying to sell merchandise in funeral service. I educate on what each product is, let the family make the decision based on what information they have. But a lot of times people don't know, they're trying to make emotional decisions. They might spend more than they need to because they're, just trying to make decisions on the fly.
Well, like mom deserves the best casket.
Right.
The next thing I know, they got a $25,000 funeral service.
And maybe she does, right? Maybe she only drove red Cadillacs, and she had the finest mahogany furniture, and maybe it made sense for mom to be in a mahogany, and that's what she wanted. Maybe that service is $25,000 because I've seen that, but I've also seen that room when they're like, okay, well, they have the money, but it's like, who's going to front the 25 grand to be reimbursed? So down to the family that says, look, mom was really simple. She didn't want anything. She wants cremation. We're going to honor her life at the beach. And funeral director's like, yeah, we're going to help you with that too. And that's going to be, $4,500. We're big swing in costs, but people are still looking around. It's $4,500. It's not every day you go out and drop $4,500 or
Right.
25 grand. So being prepared for that, which is completely avoidable, like we said, is huge right now, more than ever.
Well, let's go back to the corporations buying these funeral homes nationally.
Mhm.
And I don't know this for a fact, so I'm kind of asking you. This is what I think is happening. These corporations are smart. They
Very
don't
much so.
brand it Best Buy Funeral Home and have these franchise names. They realize that people want to go to the local funeral home. So if it's Bob Jones Funeral Home, guess what? Bob Jones Funeral Home may be bought by Best Buy Funeral gazillion-dollar corporation.
Mhm.
And Bob Jones might still work there because he has a phase-out program.
Yep.
So in the community, they may not know that their local funeral home is owned by these large corporations and has kind of a zero flexibility policy on what they're able to do.
Yeah, I think, you're right. They're smart. They are, because they're corporate doesn't make them, bad people and that they're
Right.
serving the community in a bad way. But you're right. There are more purchases being made by corporations, and there are several of them across the US, and some that are publicly traded and some that are not. But short answer is yes. They are the probably most, like, the biggest sticklers on timely payment. And they will not back away from that because they need and have to show revenue, right? It's part of, revenue to Service Corporation International quarterly is different to Bob Jones Funeral Home, who has been in business for 40 years. And
Right. He's privately held, and it just affects his bottom line, not,
right.
all the shareholders.
Yep.
Bottom
And,
line.
like I said before, funeral services changed, right? So 40 years ago, 30 years ago, even 20 years ago, it was a business where families sat down. They were very connected to a church, a parish, some sort of faith, right? So a majority of people buried their dead. Cremation was just starting to creep in terms of a solution for families. Now, in the state of Michigan, we're well over 50%, not quite 60, but we're getting there and climbing. So, conversations with families on choice of disposition, which is cremation, burial, entombment. They have their first basically natural burial, like a natural decomposing process out in Washington that was approved. So where we could talk about that process later and not get you too sick over a Zoom, but the reality is like the game has changed, right? People are
Right.
less churched. The consumer is a little bit more demanding in terms of experience and what are you going to provide. The loyalty factor is drops among funeral brands because maybe there's a new funeral home in town. Maybe they just are going to go against the grain that their mom always went to this funeral home, so we're going to go to this funeral home. So maybe it's bought by a corporation, right? And the tide shifts.
Aren't there like some third-party consultants that families hire that kind of manage a lot of that, and then
like death doulas almost. Yeah, like death doulas, right? So like the consumer,
like a party planner kind of.
yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's where we, like guys like you and I and our organizations, can hopefully, based on our experience, both what you've seen and what I've seen, and every day people dying. And I would say the biggest thing, like you said, is the timeliness and the amount of emotion it can remove by having a financial plan. Simplest of cremations to the most traditional, like you said, if it's that glitzy funeral with the most expensive casket and the price tag ends up being $25,000, even if they have the money, have the plan, have the financial plan. That just takes a lot of it's that vacuum period that we talked about, right, where we can remove it.
Well, I talk about the beneficiary liquidity plan being the final piece to the financial plan.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of people, they'll even go to the point to say, well, Phil, I have a trust. Great. Is there a funeral and expense section of your trust? Well, yeah. I said, well, flip to that. and they'll flip to it, and it'll usually have some words that talk about who's supposed to kind of be in charge. They'll talk about, money, but nowhere does it say this is where the money should come from. And so even though they've spent thousands of dollars to put a living trust or revocable trust in place, it doesn't give them it doesn't give the family access to money. And so
it does not, right.
This is that final piece, which that's also why you and I work with so many estate planning attorneys, is they're adding the beneficiary liquidity plan on as the final piece to that estate plan or that financial plan. So you and I typically work either direct with consumers, with financial advisors, insurance planners, funeral homes, and estate planning attorneys, because we're that missing piece in most of their plans that make it actually work.
Right. And I think for the consumer, it is just for those professionals too, right? Like it's an easily avoidable topic, because we're talking about making things smooth in the transition of death with an estate planning attorney. That's what people want. Like, all my stuff's taken care of, but I don't want to really talk about the actual cost of me dying.
Right. Because all that does is avoids probate, helps with estate taxes,
right.
Make sure that your money is dispersed to your families or charities or churches the way you want. But everybody forgets, well, what about the first expense that I have? And that's the funeral or the cremation and the celebration of life and those other bills for the first 60 days until we can start implementing all those other things. Everybody forgets that part. Or let me rephrase that. They don't know it's a problem until it's already a problem.
It's true. And yes, short answer is yes. And I work with some tremendous estate planning attorneys. And I started to try to re-educate even some, like, back, because I've learned a ton from them on process, and I am not an attorney and don't claim to be, but I've tried to do my best to say, look, with this big binder that you've given them, you've done such a great job making sure that nothing goes wrong should one of them die or both of them die at the same time, right? But at the end of those binders, there's 3 pages that says, funeral plans or, prearrangement, and it's 95% of the time left blank.
Right.
So it's no wonder that we have this vacuum period that I've been talking about. The estate is nicely, tightly wrapped, not accessible until we start administering the estates. A lot of times, obviously, we can't do anything without a death certificate, right? We haven't even covered that. A death certificate could take anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks to get, depending on where you live in the U.S., right? So with BLP,
let's transition into that, then, John, and we'll transition into the death certificate, and then I want to talk about what typical expenses look like, because I know that you're deeply involved in the average cost. But so you got 20 years experience in the funeral homes. You've worked with thousands of funeral homes. What is your experience with how long it takes families to get certified copies of the death certificate? Because, to be honest, I get pushback sometimes from people saying, "Oh, I can get it in a couple days. It's not a problem. I'm not worried about that, Phil." But all my research shows that that's not the case. So what's your experience in the funeral business on families getting certified copies of the death certificate?
So let's even just use 2020 as an example of how things have changed. So with COVID and the pandemic, we were seeing death certificates be out 2 to 3 months in the Metro Detroit area, just because of no one was reporting to work, right?
Right.
So there was a lot of that. And then what they've realized is, obviously now with less workers and things like that too at the county building, and things being not really fully open here with staff. So we're seeing timelines just continuing to be longer. And I would say 2 days would be a miracle to have a certified death certificate. Because here's the thing, when someone dies, let's think about the timeline, right? Death call comes into the funeral home, and we take that call, and we are honored to care for that family, and we take that deceased into our care. Death deaths occur 24 hours a day, right? It could be 2 in the afternoon or 2 in the morning, and we're responding to the place of death within an hour. That person comes into our care. Maybe the family meets us in the morning, maybe they don't. So now we're 2 days, let's say more than likely, if it's an evening death, we're meeting that family not the next day, but the following. So now we're gone by 2 days already past death, right? We're arranging services in that arrangement conference. We're getting all of the vital statistics to then submit the death certificate to the doctor, right? Now, I don't know about you, but doctors and schedules and trying to get them to sign a specific document, not to mention to be to pull the file at the doctor's office to see exactly what the conditions were, to list the cause of death and causes accurately. License number sign off, that takes time. We've waited on doctors' offices for days, right? So once we get that signed copy, we then have to review it. Family reviews it, signs off on it. We take it to the county clerk, file it, get the certified copies, or now electronically, we're submitting that to the counties.
Yeah, everything I see is electronically now.
Yeah.
Looks like.
Yep. So, which you think would speed up the process, but we have just seen, lag time. So if people are expecting to get their death certificates immediately, I hate to say to be another bearer of bad news, that things will continue to be slower in that department. And a lot of times people will need a certified copy. Some people will need just a photocopy. So it's no telling. I mean, things could be way different in Los Angeles County than they are in Metro Detroit, and New York City is a whole lot different than, Baltimore County. And, I'm just speaking on kind of Midwest, but it is certainly not 2 days. I would say it's more realistically now like 2 weeks to 4 weeks to get things. And that's just to get the death certificate. You haven't started on any things that go along with that, right?
Processes or anything else. Well, if you go to Texas Public Health and Human Services website, right online, for electronic processing, it's 25 to 30 days minimum, right on their website.
There you go.
Connecticut, I believe, last time I looked, was 6 to 8 weeks.
Sure.
Right on their website. And I think everybody thought electronic processing was going to be quicker, but I think the reality of it is it actually is delayed it a little bit more than, waiting at the clerk's office and just standing there.
I would agree.
In your state's capital,
right?
And saying, please certify this. Like, that's not even an option anymore.
No, I mean, and a lot, like you said, some of these buildings you can't even get into right now across the U.S. It differs where you're at, right? So do not.
They'll probably never go back to in person, though. It's like once people go electronic, then they don't need all the employees. Like, our whole country's kind of moving that direction of less in person and more electronic.
Well, and the closest thing to in person that they have now here locally is they will tell you when the death certificates are ready that you can pick up in there in a file in the lobby. So, just less human interaction. Come in, drop your check, get your death certificates. But that is not happening in 2 days, and it's not happening in 4 days. It's not happening in 5 days. It's happening over the course of weeks.
Excellent. And again, I come back to the Beneficiary Liquidity Plan does not require a death certificate to release those funds. Correct. Except in the states of Indiana, Kentucky, Louisiana, and Massachusetts. Little asterisk there. Every other state, no death certificate. And because these families aren't buying more inheritance, it's simply moving money from the left pocket to the right pocket. We eliminate all that, because you didn't even get into what if there's an autopsy? What if it's an accidental cause of death? It could be months. So we just eliminate all that. And we tell people, like, why risk it? Why make this hard for your family when it's already probably one of the hardest days in their life? And I ask people, I'm like, you're leaving your family an inheritance, right? Something. Well, yeah. And you're going to want them to use part of that money to cover these expenses. You don't want that to be a burden, right? No, of course not, Phil. I don't want to be a burden to my family. Well, then if it doesn't cost you anything to guarantee it's not a burden, why wouldn't we put a beneficiary liquidity plan in place? We can literally do it over the phone. Everybody qualifies as long as you're not 100. So as long as you're not triple digits in age, right? You could be in a nursing home, in hospice, and still qualify to put a plan in place. It's not too late unless you've already passed. Using the money you've already earmarked for your family so that on one of the worst days of their life, the day you pass away, it's not a burden. Why would you not fix it if it's that easy to put a plan in place?
It's really that simple. That's where I think where you and I every day talk to these professionals that do an outstanding job to fold this conversation in. Look, there's going to be this vacuum period. We've learned that this plan can really eliminate that. And we're looking to help you with that. And this is how we intend to do that. So that's where I love doing these things with you to further educate our fellow professionals that this, because there's a lot of, just as families don't know these exist, right? I think there's a fair amount of our fellow professionals that don't realize a plan like this exists. And whether it's you, myself, or that attorney or that financial planner that's spreading the message, we need to do more of this.
Absolutely. Well, so let's transition into, the expenses that families incur. Like a lot of people are like, oh, it's just a cremation. Well, they may not even understand what that cost is, but you have experience. Like there's a laundry list of expenses that somebody's having to pay for when a loved one passes away. And you'd sent me some numbers the other day, kind of going through like the national averages on that. Like, what are some of those expenses that families have?
So the National Funeral Directors Association, which is, kind of the longest standing national representation of funeral professionals, and quite honestly, internationally as well, we get together regionally all the time in one big gathering like this year in Nashville. And every, I would say 5 years, they put out a cost study or the GPL, which is short for General Price List. Every funeral home in the U.S., if they're a licensed funeral establishment and operating in accordance with the FTC, should have what's called a general price list, which includes all of the charges in the funeral home, or most of them, accompanied by cost of caskets on what we call the outer burial container list, or vaults, right, that are used for burial of a casket or of an urn. So just some like basic averages for you to kind of think on. The average funeral, both cremation and burial combined, coast to coast, what does that cost combined on just pure averages? We're looking right around in 2019, $7,700, $7,700.
So that's assuming 50% of people are being cremated, 50% approximately are having a traditional,
right,
being buried.
Correct. So if we break that down even to further subcategories, the average burial contract with a funeral home, now mind you, these are just funeral expenses, funeral home services, and merchandise. There are three parts to a funeral home contract. We have the professional services, things like funeral director services of funeral director and staff, embalming, taking the person into our care 24/7, the use of facilities, so services, right? Then we have merchandise, caskets, vaults, urns, urn vaults, memorial packages. And then there's this often forgot this what we call cash advances or accommodation sections, which are outside charges of the funeral home, but often get lumped in. So the figures I'll give you of an average burial do not include that third section, which can add up quickly, as I'll point out. So for an average burial, we're looking at in 2019, $9,135. If you take the laws of average of inflation and add 2%, 2.5% over the last 3-4 years, probably going to look somewhere in the next 5 years closer to $10,000, right? For a cremation, which includes a visiting with the body present, followed by a service, followed then by cremation, most people will often ask sometimes now about a rental casket, which is used, I would say, over and over again to a certain degree, but
just for the viewing.
Correct. And then the portion of the casket, the interior, is then removed with that individual and cremated. The shell of the casket is reused. So if you use that type of casket, they're averaging coast to coast around $6,150, right? What you're probably seeing most difference there is the cost of the burial vault, where that needs to be added on to the burial side of things. So that's what costs the increase on the funeral home side there. So those are, you're talking average of 7,700, you're talking average of 9,100, even if we're rounding up over the next, 5 years for the next study, let's say it's closer to 10.
$11,000. Yeah.
Right. And $6,100, 6,200 now, probably closer to 7, right? When we do this next study. I often say to people, would you plan for that type of purchase in normal life? Do you plan for a $10,000 purchase? Well, yeah, of course. Do you plan for a $7,700 purchase? Well, absolutely. Yeah. So it's no different, right? And guess what? This is a guarantee, right? 100% club. Like I said before, taxes and
Right.
death. I realize it's not exciting, but when people see those numbers, sometimes that's where I can talk till I'm red in the face about the emotional benefits, the legal benefits that come along with planning and understanding who will really legally be in charge. And then lastly, which I'm not sure if that's really the order of importance we should be in. Maybe we should talk about the financial piece first, but I am a heart guy, so I tend to think that most people will see the value even by just having choices made. And then again, this financial piece just makes more sense. But that financial piece of having a plan is where you go from a good plan to a great plan, which is a good book too, by the way, Good to Great. But that is really where they all come together. We all plan for these types of purchases that are in the thousands. We need to take this head on. And we haven't even talked about that third section yet, what we call the cash advance items, right?
Right.
So if there's
So
a
what does that
burial,
look like?
sure. So like death certificates are often lumped in to the cost of the service. Not the case. Those are always outside cost. Each county, each state, each city, depends on where you are, have different types of charges for their death certificates. It just depends. Flowers, musicians, honorariums for the officiant, right? I've seen honorariums go in the thousands for the priest that has served their family for years. And they're okay doing it. And I am too. It's what mom wanted, is to give a donation to father. Totally cool, but it's $1,000.
Right.
We plan for $1,000 purchases, unless you're on Amazon or going to Costco. But we got things like, maybe it's special hairdresser, the big one, grave opening and closing. If the grave isn't purchased around here, the Metro Detroit area, the most reputable cemeteries, you get a country cemetery that might charge $500 for a grave. The cemeteries in the city are charging $2,500 for a grave, per grave. So you got $5,000. If dad dies suddenly, mom's going to the cemetery, hastily picking out a final resting place. And she's probably buying 2 graves, because one for herself and her now deceased husband. So now you're at $5,000 at the cemetery. Opening and closing for those now are $1,500 a piece. So you're $8,000 at the cemetery. And we haven't even talked about the headstone, Phil, right? Which can range from, cemetery requirements requiring a flat cemetery marker, which tend to be the most affordable, but maybe it's bronze what the cemetery requires. So maybe that's a, $2,500 to $3,000 bronze plaque required by the cemetery. So now we're at another $10,000.
Right.
And maybe that monument, mom wanted a jet black with a polished top and the scene of the farm in the back, which everybody can agree upon, and they love that idea. But that jet black upright monument is another $7,500. And again, it might be a 12 by 12 black flat gray marker that is simple as that, but that's still $995 to have placed. And that's still a purchase that we should probably talk about.
Right. Well, and then you got families now live all over the country. Rarely does everybody live in the same town anymore. People forget that the executor of the estate is legally, with major repercussions if they mess up, required to settle the estate. That can take months or longer, and they're not compensated for that unless it's actually written out in the plan. Travel expenses and all these things. Like I had
luncheon
this conversation
too, right? Luncheon, the after the service, those can be, I've seen those be more expensive than the funeral.
Well, I might do open bar.
Right.
It sounds like we're planning a wedding as opposed to a funeral almost, but it really is like as expensive as doing a wedding. It's a lot of the same things.
And we're doing it in 3 days.
Right.
So removing this piece is just critical. It's a piece that has not been talked about enough on our professional level. And I'll even own some of that as a funeral professional. And this is where I've dedicated the last 7 years of telling people, after listening, trying to communicate how important this is. Because back to the point, they have the funds, they've planned for retirement, they've had the opportunity to be in a good spot financially. And this part is just avoided. But I'm on this mission, you're on this mission to communicate that these funds need to be available. Not like should they be, they need to be.
Because a lot of times, John, we'll have people say, well, Phil, I'm worth $5 million.
Mm-hmm.
I got so much money. They don't say it like that. They're like, I have plenty of money. And like, yeah, if it's 25, 30 grand and I want that headstone, whatever, that's fine. But they don't realize that $5 million is not available for the family.
Right.
Or they'll say, well, Phil, my son's an attorney. My daughter's a doctor. They both have plenty of money. They can figure it out.
Right.
And I'm like, do you really want your kids in the funeral home? Maybe they can't afford it, but maybe they're arguing over who's going to get the miles on their Amex Platinum.
Mm-hmm.
You're leaving them money. Why wouldn't you show them that you had enough forethought to set it aside so they didn't have to think about it? They could focus on that life. And so whether somebody's got a little bit of money or a lot of money, I've found that sometimes people that have a lot of money need it even more.
I agree.
Because that money's going to be tied up for longer
mm-hmm.
before the family actually gets access to it.
Yes. So we'll just keep down that path that, there is a vacuum period, whether you have a little money or a lot of money. As a child, I'm a funeral director, a dad, a son, all these things, right? And I've experienced both planning for thousands of people face to face, eyeball to eyeball, and I've experienced the death, planning for a death. And my dad and we were a perfect example. They're spread, all the kids are spread across the country. I'm the funeral director in the family. When my dad died last March, guess who got tapped to plan this, which, oh, by the way, was already planned and paid for. And the idea and I saw that work, and I saw how even somebody that understands the business, and through a plan like this, we were able to execute quickly on signatures versus conversation.
Right.
I had the conversation with my dad about what type of service he wanted and what we would need as a family, right? Because he was even that guy that said, well, just cremate me. And I'm like, we can't do that. You have 4 kids, you have 7 brothers and sisters. We're not just going to cremate you. You're too important to us.
Right.
Would you be open to us having a gathering period to honor you? And when we talked about that and what that would look like, he was all about it. And I said, well, that's great, but now how are we going to pay for it? So,
right.
Because
you would have gotten stuck paying for it more 100%. Than likely.
And I always tell people, look, just because I'm a funeral director doesn't mean I get funerals for free. It's not like the flight attendant program here. In a companion, you get X amount of flights for free a year. It's not like that. And I'm expected to pay on time. So the fact that I was able to have a plan like this and sign off, my brothers and sisters were able to sign off, and that funeral home that cared for my family and my dad during our time of loss was paid within not 48, but 24 hours. They were expediting that for us. It took the weight off my shoulders of somebody that was going through it, even as a professional. So I can speak to it personally, that I've experienced how with 4 siblings that most of us all of us get along on an average day, but there are things that we can't agree on, like pizza toppings. So when my dad's dead, that would probably be the time where we couldn't agree. And right. It had already started. But guess what? We had the paper that said, this is what Dad wanted. If there's any huge objections to this, let's talk about it. But it made it pretty clear. And again, the financial piece was there with it. Right. So
Because
packaged
that tends to
nicely.
be the trigger for a lot of people is money. Let's face it, that's what most marriages fight over.
Mhm.
Families, business partners, siblings, like money is a main component to a lot of arguments and disagreements.
It's true. And funeral homes need to be paid. They should be paid for their services, especially the ones that are every day making a difference, that are in a difference in care and not showing up just to show up and uninterested. The ones that are really doing their job well, I always say, should be paid on time, because they performed what they said they would at the highest level and exceeded your expectations. And this allows them to be paid, and the family can say, fantastic. We're
Yeah.
not reaching into our wallet. Mom made this decision to move from, like you say, from one pocket to the other, as opposed to, you know, buying something else.
Right.
Mhm.
So I had a financial advisor friend of mine. He's been in business 35 years. And the question he asked me was, well, Phil, what happens if the family can't get to any money and the kids really don't have
Mhm.
money? Like the bodies that mom's there at the funeral home,
Mhm.
no one's got any money or claims to not have any money. What happens?
It's hard, right? So most of my colleagues in funeral service will, if there is truly that family that does not, there's different scenarios, right? Mom has money, kids don't, um, and there's no access to the money, and maybe
Well,
mom
they were
has,
waiting for mom to pass away so
right,
they could have money.
right. But again, back to the original point, most funeral homes want to be paid, and rightfully so. The the challenge is, when there is no money, we can resort to things like Department of Human Services as a solution, which, nobody really is excited about going through. And quite honestly, it limits a ton to what's available to the family in terms of services.
It's almost like
That the
Medicaid, right?
It is. Funeral homes will typically lose a significant amount of money by performing those services, but are, invested in the goodwill of the community. So as long as those claims are legit, and a lot of my colleagues, again, heart is in this first before their wallet. They are business people, but they understand there are circumstances. So number one, I always say that the funeral professional in the room will try to, in some way, work with the county if that's a piece that they can help supplement. We're seeing funeral homes now suggest GoFundMe's. Uh, a lot of.
If you go, this is scary. If you go to GoFundMe
Mhm.
and you type in funeral or memorial, hundreds of thousands of active campaigns right now.
And we're seeing more and more of that. I don't want to say sometimes families feel embarrassed that they have to do that. And again, like a lot of the time, it could be completely avoided. And not to mention that those types of organizations do take a percentage of those donations. Um, but what we're seeing is sometimes families aren't able to have honor the life that they would like to. And again, it doesn't mean that they want this full-blown traditional funeral. It might be a cremation with a memorial service that the funeral home's involved in, that they have a celebration center in the back of their parking lot, that the family is not churched. They can use this area. We're seeing a lot of funeral homes offer these types of gathering spaces that are not funeral home-esque. They're cool and trendy and high ceilings and a place to gather, and they'll do weddings and showers and Lions Club meetings and open it up to community as a place of gathering. So those types of opportunities are being missed by families because, and the funeral home certainly can't give those services away for free.
Right.
So when families don't have access to money, or they don't have available funds to, perform the services that they wish, sometimes the county will step in and provide some assistance that really is nowhere near going to cover expenses by any stretch of the imagination. GoFundMe, they're having to ask Aunt Kathy, who, owns 2,000 acres and has more money than she knows what to do with. It's that awkward conversation. Then Aunt Kathy's involved because she's the payer, right? But everyone asks Aunt Kathy for money, but now she's in charge, paying. But now the funeral director is in a weird spot because he or she might have to follow next of kin laws of who's in charge of the funeral, of what they can do. But now Kathy's paying, so Kathy feels like she's in charge, but legally
Right.
she's really not. She's just paying for it. So it just creates so many scenarios that are, again, avoidable.
What about two other scenarios that people have brought up? One, there's like these short-term funeral funding companies, like
Mhm.
not like a payday loan, but they're like a short-term loan. You can go borrow money, or people used to do like some, we call them collateral assignments, where they're like, hey, mom has this policy. Once we get the death certificates and file the claims in like 60 to 90 days, we should have some money we can pay you. Like, are those even options still acceptable today? And like, what's your
Short
opinion?
answer is yes. And yeah. So Lending USA is one example, right? Like they provide funding services for families. There's other companies out there, and they're extending monies to the funeral home on credit to the family. Typically, those are higher interest rates, right?
Well, it's short term and
Right.
probably minimal qualifications. So
Yeah, and probably in the eyes of that credit company, higher risk. So that's why they have
absolutely.
the opportunity to charge a higher interest rate. So they exist. I don't know too many folks in my network that offer them on the regular, but they are there and available. But is that the best route? Like
Well, it comes
for
back to,
most,
you're
right?
leaving your family money. Why would you make them go through that process of paperwork, qualifying, the stress, higher interest rates, paying it back, when you could have just moved a little bit of money from your left pocket to right pocket into the beneficiary liquidity plan and solved it in advance?
Yeah, and the same goes for assignments, right? Like as we'll call them. Some funeral homes still accept those, but some will say, "Look, it's great that your mom had an insurance policy." Um, and we haven't even talked about some things that come into play when people have insurance policies, have planned and paid for years, and Medicaid comes into play, right? And they lose that insurance policy uh, to the nursing home for cost of care. Um, and why I always say like those types of policies should not be used for the funeral expenses. I'm 100% on board with people having life insurance. I am not on board with those life insurances policies being specifically earmarked for funeral care for the reasons we've just talked about. And this one specifically, where funeral homes are less likely to accept an assignment at the time of arrangement, because you got to think about that funeral director. If I'm meeting that family and they say we have a $10,000 insurance policy that was earmarked for mom's funeral care, now I have to take a step back, go in the other room with maybe the beneficiaries there, maybe they are not, to verify the amounts of the funds in that policy. And the beneficiary has to give them permission to give me information on that policy. Then I have to do an assignment and hope that that beneficiary signs off on at the end of the day that assignment. And so it's a bit clunky, and I think funeral homes are realizing that, and it's costing family, and it's become clunky that there's actually even companies in funeral service that will take the insurance policy, front the funeral home the money, right? And they collect their 3%, their 4% on processing fees uh, to have the insurance assignment assigned to them. I'm not saying it's a bad service, but the family ultimately is giving up something. And in that form, if it's a $10,000 policy, it might be the 3%
But
fee.
to me, it still comes back to where, like, the loved one that passed away, I can't imagine that the majority of the time they want their loved ones to go through these processes.
No,
They
that's the whole
thought,
thing.
I have money. When I die, they can get the money and everything's fine. They don't know that it's not available for 30, 60, 90 days or more,
Right.
and that somebody's having to have this stress of credit cards, or borrow money from Aunt Kathy, or collateral assigning if that's available, or these fast lending, like what the person that passed away envisioned was they're going to be celebrating my life. The family's going to come together and everything's going to be hunky dory. And the reality of it is, if someone hasn't planned ahead, it's typically going to be clunky.
It is. There's no doubt. And that's where, and it's not their fault that they don't know this, right? Like, and I'm not, it's not their fault that they think it's going to go this way. But that's why you and I and other BLP professionals are out there trying to kind of like clear the air, pull the veil back and say, this is reality. This is what happens. This is day to day that I see with families, that you see with advisors successfully being able to fulfill these plans for families and seeing the look on their face. Maybe they didn't know mom had this BLP plan in place. Right. It's like, so it's not their fault that they don't know that these things exist. It's our mission to make sure that people know, both on the professional side and on the consumer side, that this exists, it's real. And these things that we're talking about today, the emotional, the financial, the legal, all exist every single time. Nothing goes perfect when someone dies. But I know, like I said before, they don't die differently in San Francisco than they do in Maryland and Detroit and Minnesota. And people don't feel differently emotionally when those people die. And there's always a cost associated with death. And no one would ever argue that having a plan and or a financial plan behind them when that death occurs is a bad idea.
Well, in a sense, especially since they don't make premium payments, so they're not buying anything. B, they've already earmarked some sort of asset or dollar for their family to use. C, it takes 5 to 10 minutes maximum to actually put the plan in place.
Right.
And it can be done over the phone because it's already their money.
Sure.
It's the simplest process I've seen. Oh, and they don't have to go to the funeral home and pick out everything in their service. I know that holds a lot of people back, John, is like, well, I don't want to go down to the funeral home. I don't want to have to, face this fact and pick out my urn or my casket or go through this. They don't have to do that with the beneficiary liquidity plan. I think we would both still recommend they have some process in place so that isn't 100% put on their family. But there's no reason they shouldn't go ahead and at least make sure the money is going to be there. Heaven forbid something happen sooner rather than later.
I'd 100% agree. And having, and that's where, Great Lakes can extend some additional services to families, right? If they, we work with the attorney here locally in Metro Detroit, and he or she says, look, everything is taken care of financially. We've talked about where we need to move this from one pocket to the other. We work with Jon and BLP to make sure that funds are available at the time of passing, and this is the best possible solution for you. And oh, by the way, our partner, Great Lakes, has, 10 funeral homes in our immediate service area that they and we would feel comfortable taking our parents to. Michelle O'Hara, right, my wife, who works at a funeral home here locally, if that family, and again, a suggestion, not a requirement, if that attorney says, hey, I'd like you to talk to Jon for 10 minutes because he wants to talk, it'd be probably a good idea to understand what goes along with the cremation that you've kind of talked about. And he's the funeral director. I am not. Like, totally cool. Like, I love those conversations with families. And if we can get some of those things ironed out, that is well worth our time. So even connecting them with Michelle, like at Sullivan Funeral Directors in Utica and Royal Oak, Michigan. Michelle's the best at what she does. She's fantastic. So that attorney then, or that financial planner, trusts Michelle. It would be somebody that they would take their mother to. I would take my mom to. That those funeral directors there are and have been in the business for over 116 years. They're doing something right. They care about the communities. We would take our parents to them. If the family says, look, we don't have a funeral home of choice, and that sounds great, I'd love to meet Michelle and get the specifics of my cremation plan picked out. She's not going to sell you anything additional. The money's already there. And maybe that's the place where your folder and your wishes and your claim form for the BLP, for that matter.
Right.
And that can always change. If you move to Arizona because you're sick of the snow, cool. I will, and Sullivan's will find you that funeral home in Tempe that we would take our parents to. So
yes,
that's really how we're going to like connect the dots, as I say, both like, we just don't want to get them into a beneficiary liquidity plan. It's like, we will then take it a step further. And this is for everybody. They call me, I don't care what organization you're from. If they need help, we're going to help them. And we're going to answer their questions about cremation and burial to benefit them, because it's about creating the experience for that family and checking off those boxes, the emotional, the financial, and the legal aspects, and the unique circumstances of each life that we need to consider when planning.
I love that. Here's a great question. This comes up a lot, Jon, and I have to imagine you've been helping families pre-plan for over a decade. Well, Phil, I have my son or my daughter, little Johnny or little Sally, on my bank account as joint owner. They can just access that money when I die and pay for all this. Have you ever seen that not work out for the family when that was their plan, was to add their child or some other family member as joint owner on their checking account?
All the time. And you can list the reasons why that's a bad idea. Just even legally and financially.
Legally, what people don't realize is when you name somebody as joint owner, if you do it correctly, they're legally, not actually, legally the owner on that account, which means they're taxed on that account, which means if they want to spend the money, they can, but that's usually the least of my worries, is that person stealing it. If they get divorced, any good divorce attorney is going to go take that money, because guess what? It's theirs. They file bankruptcy, have credit issues, the money's gone. They get in an accident, get sued, the money's gone. And we've seen banks at death, if they know the person died, they will temporarily freeze those accounts sometimes, because they just want to make sure everything's handled properly.
Yeah, they don't want the risk, right? And rightfully so. And I will add in, because again, the heart guy, right? You went through all the legal and financial reasons why to not do that. I've seen time and time again that checkbook gets open where they're getting ready to write that check for the funeral, and the brothers and sisters for the first time see that Jim is on the checkbook and not them. So now you've just opened up Pandora's box, that Jim, all the last 6 months, because that's when they met with the attorney to get things figured, or whatever, or let's say they probably didn't meet an attorney, because I don't think an attorney is going to recommend that to be on the checkbook. But let's say that Jim was doing some planning because he had heard some things on TV or found some things on the internet, right? And now Jim's on the checkbook because he lives with mom. And I mean, I've seen this stuff time and time and time again, right? And it's like, you have, like, verbatim, you have access to mom's check. You've had access to mom's checkbook as they're trying to,
because they look at it as that's the family's going, the brothers and sisters are going, wait, that's my money now.
Right. So just even in that instance of funeral arrangements, I've seen where people go from rosy cheeks to as white as your shirt when they've realized that their 5 siblings had no idea that they're on mom's checking account that has $100,000 in it. Right. And now they know, and started putting the pieces together. Well, mom's dead. How am I going to get my name on that checking account? And,
well, normally the will also, because if I'm that beneficiary and my name's on the account, a lot of times that's my money and wasn't accounted for in the will of how assets were distributed. So I just got more money possibly as well.
Yeah, like you said, divorce. So let's say you have a stroke, or I have a stroke, and my name's on my mom. Let's put it in reverse, right? So let's say I need long-term care because I'm 65 years old. My mom's 90. I'm on her checking account. I have a stroke. Now I need to qualify for Medicaid. Now I have an asset of $100,000 because I'm on my mom's checking account. I mean, it could be in the reverse. to why that's not a good idea to be on your mom's checking account. And so, yeah, I mean, there's just so many scenarios why that doesn't make sense, right? And to have a plan like this, it is emotional of a time it is. I say the BLP plans take the emotion out of the room when it comes to the financial piece. It's there, it's accounted for, and it's a signature to distribute the funds for the services selected. And hopefully in the scenario that we just talked about, maybe even in best case scenario, pre-selected with someone like Michelle O'Hara, where they've worked cohesively with the professional, the estate planning attorney, to now the best of the best when it comes to the care of the funeral home. They're working with Michelle. Those two bridges have been, put together, and it's a full circle of care where everyone is on the same page. And it's really not that difficult, right? So
Right.
that's two simple meetings, and like a huge amount of stress is like out the window for everybody involved.
So as far as putting a child or sibling or loved one on your checking account as joint owner, what I normally tell people is, yeah, it could work. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, no, that absolutely would not work. But what I'm going to say is that you've added a tremendous amount of risk to that asset, to that money, the possibility for stress and arguments and disagreements. And because it doesn't cost anything to put a beneficiary liquidity plan in place, I don't understand why you wouldn't set up that plan, because now it's protected from creditors, from Medicaid, all these other benefits, on top of the most important is it's guaranteed to be liquid within 24 to 48 hours after you pass away without a death certificate. Why would you take the risk when it doesn't cost anything to fix it? It takes 5 to 10 minutes. We can do it over the phone. Like, we've literally eliminated all the objections as to why somebody wouldn't put a plan in place, except the two we talked about earlier. They don't have any money at all, which then there wouldn't be someone joint on their checking account, or they don't like their beneficiaries. Other than those two reasons, there really aren't any. Oh, the third one, I guess, is if you're 100 years old.
Right.
You got to be 99 or younger. But other than that, it eliminates all those potential problems and puts the plan in place so that on one of the worst days of your family's life, the day you pass away, it's not a burden. And I think that's what you and I do. Even though you came from the funeral side, I came from the financial planning and insurance side. Our goal is to take away the burden from the family and make this difficult day as wonderful of a day as we can. I've focused specifically on making sure the family has money. You've added that to your funeral and planning element. You saw the need for the funding side as well, which what I think is brilliant about what you're doing is you've paired your 20 plus years experience of planning, working with families, working from your heart, and you've added this solution of also making sure the families have access to funds when they need them.
Exactly. Connecting all those dots, having, and again, as many times throughout the day, I used to be the guy that would be at the funeral home and people say, you know what, John, we're out and about, right? Like, oh, that's really cool what you do. I've been meaning to do that for years. And this is like a little bit more where I take that step forward now instead of backwards. 10 years ago would have been, oh, you just call when you're ready, right? Like, you call me when you're ready, and they'll never be ready, right? No one is ever like, you know what? I'm going to go plan my funeral today. Like, there are some, and there's about maybe 10% of even our leads each year that get up every morning or that say, I'm going to go do this. And
well, a lot of times is it triggered because a loved one passed away, or they just experienced it as as the surviving person. Like, wow, I don't want my family to have to deal with what I just dealt with.
Exactly. Right. So the number one reason why people prearrange or think about pre-planning any type of their own death is because they've experienced a significant loss. which makes sense, right? It's like we make a
Top
lot
of
of
mind.
decisions
It's like,
right.
oh no, I need to do this.
It's not that difficult. It's like people around here, it's like, I'm going to go get a boat because I had a great time this summer on my friend's boat. It's like, I'm going to go buy a boat, it's not that different. Yes, different circumstances, but we're leading with emotion, right? It's like, I got to get this taken care of. I saw George's family go through hell because he didn't have anything, and there's so many scenarios with family now, blended families, like you said, the
Well, they
geographical,
got his, hers, and theirs.
right.
And that's an interesting dynamic when it comes to distribution at death.
100%, right? So this is where, like, at where the rubber meets the road in the arrangement room, you can see almost after 22 years of experience of meeting families, you can see what the path is going to be like for these folks following the service, right? Like, if they've done well by their family and tried to get these things even on the ground level of having money available for services, it just starts them off on a good journey in their grief journey. And like, the money piece has been eliminated. And as much as I talk about the emotional side of things, we all make emotional purchases. So the emotion and the financial side come together and run side by side. And yes, they are different, but they are generally becoming one and the same, right? Like, dad's dead, we got to make a decision on a funeral home. So like, it all should be working together. We've had a great experience with this BLP plan. We met with Michelle O'Hara after and got all of mom's wishes down. We know that that's on file with Rutkowski, Samasco, or Jeff Bruss. And we know that they're well taken care of at Sullivan Funeral Directors in Royal Oak because they are the premier provider. And all of those dots have been connected. All we have to do is pick up the phone. That's it.
Absolutely. And I think it's hard for people to just start the thought process if they haven't had a life event that triggered that.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, well, I don't even know where to start. Well, we created a very simple survey that takes less than 5 minutes for people to complete.
Mm-hmm.
You can either do it digitally or on paper. And it's just yes or no questions. You just check boxes. So it's nothing difficult to complete. But the purpose is just to start getting a few thoughts on paper. And we get those results. And what we do with families when they submit those results is we then schedule a call to walk through your answers, because what we found is that by just having yes or no boxes, you can't always articulate
right
what you're really thinking, but it's a very simple conversation starter. There's no obligation to complete the survey. We'll provide your results back to you. So if you're watching this video or these videos, there should be a link to either complete the digital survey, which you can do right online, or request a paper version if you want to do it on paper and send it back in either through email, fax, or mail. What I encourage you is, if you don't already have a beneficiary liquidity plan in place, even if in your mind you think you have a plan, I'm going to tell you that 99% of people's plans don't work the way they think. I encourage you to take just a few minutes to complete the survey. Someone will reach out to you on our team to discuss your answers. And then you'll have a better idea of vision of, do you need to make any changes? Do I need to take any next steps? Do I want to go fully plan and pick everything out? Or do I just want to make sure that I have a beneficiary liquidity plan so it's not a burden? So I encourage you to click on that link, complete the survey. I think that's an easy, non-threatening step for you to get started, because like Jon said, the only things that are guaranteed in this life are death and taxes. And we want to make sure that on the worst days of your family's life, the day you pass away, it's not a burden and not cost you anything to fix the problem. Jon, do you have anything you want to add on that as well?
Just a key, and I will double back on the thing that you underscored most. Like, we understand that people don't want to go into funeral homes and pick out caskets and urns. I understand that. And this is why BLP exists. Because like I said before, if we're running along, there's an emotional choice and there's a financial choice, those things meet up and they tend to run closer than most people think. So if you can eliminate probably one of the biggest decisions, which is financial, start there. I mean, as a funeral director, I'm trained to get people through arrangements with no plan at all. But if they've met with a financial advisor or an attorney or a planning professional, and they said, look, and we've worked together to give them resources on average costs, we've done a decent job to get them at least prepared financially and what that cost would be over time rising. So the funeral professional that meets with them is already ahead, because someone like you, someone like myself, someone like our partners that are attorneys will say, look, based on kind of pie in the sky, what you're thinking, you don't need to make any choices today, but you decided you want cremation with a viewing at the funeral home and followed by mass at St. Paul's. Like John's informed us, here's our average sheet, right? That's going to be today around $7,000. You know, you're 65 years old. Let's talk about what that cost is going to be 10 years from now, just to plan accordingly. And that's a simple conversation that covers a lot of ground. And if that funeral director knows is what that family's planning for, and it's paid for, we're just that much farther ahead. So don't think that these choices have to be made from top to bottom. Like you said, we're trying to hybrid that and put the emphasis that cost is a factor, tax and death, only thing guaranteed in life. And the other thing is you're guaranteed in life, or not guaranteed, I should say, is when and where you will die. That's the other piece, the final piece. When and where you will die is still a mystery for all of us. And having a financial plan for that is huge. And let's not to mention that people always don't die at home or at the hospital, right? They could be in California visiting their kids, and we need to get that individual back. So there's so many scenarios. When
we
and
didn't
where,
even get into how much that costs.
we did not, but I will leave you with this as a teaser for another video. When I was working as a funeral director, like day to day, we served the Greek community here in Metro Detroit frequently, and a gentleman had died in Greece, and of course the family was planning on bringing him home to the U.S. in Metro Detroit. Take a guess how much that cost, Phil.
I don't want to overshoot, but I would guess $15,000.
You're right on the mark. You're right on the mark, and we haven't even started planning the funeral yet. That was just for services to get this person back from Greece. Scenario B, Mexico, right? People go to Mexico all the time for vacation. Don't die in Cancun, please, because the negotiations that take place between funeral homes down there, start at 20, and we can usually, but it's not a position you want to be in to not have financial backing ahead of time for a situation like that. So probably worst case scenario, but it happens all the time.
Right. Understood.
Like Florida, Texas, not necessarily Mexico, but yeah. So,
and I believe technically you're not supposed to take ashes across state lines in your car either.
Well, you can do that. They're just supposed to be accessible. If you fly them, you have to be, able to be accessed to the urn. Those are all things that we can cover on.
There's a lot of rules that people don't even understand what that looks like.
Yeah. So, and that's why we're here, and that's why we'll continue to do these quick calls to give people reputable information.
Well, let's start by, if you're listening today, please fill out the survey. It only takes less than 5 minutes. We'll schedule a call. We can talk through the answers. It's an easy first step without you having to mentally lock in on what you want to do. It's just an easy way to start getting the thoughts flowing.
Yep.
And I promise it'll be an easy path, and it doesn't cost anything to put a beneficiary liquidity plan in place. So thank you, John, for being on. And I can't wait to do some more videos with you.
My pleasure. Thanks again, Phil.